Ba-ba-ba-ba-da-da-bum-bum-bum. Hi everyone, this is Rabbi Kenneth Hahn for JUTV, and today I'm hosting a segment of Ask the Rabbi Thursdays, and I'd like to encourage you all to share a link even now with this live broadcast with friends, and if you're watching it later on a tape delay, share that link as well. So, to be honest with you, I thought I was going to have to write a question and then answer that question. And that was my plan until this past Monday evening when I was flying back from California to my home in Massachusetts. And I was sitting next to a man on the segment from San Diego to Baltimore. And he was a very learned man in Christian theology. And he didn't know a whole heck of a lot about Judaism. And he had a lot of questions. And as a matter of fact, he had enough questions that I could probably use his questions for the rest of this year and all of next year. But he had one, and I use this adjective purposefully, burning question that he just really wanted to know the answer to. And that question was, what is the Jewish view, as he put it, on the afterlife? In particular, heaven and hell. And the first thing I had to tell him was that there's really no such thing in this instance as in most instances as the Jewish view. You know that old adage, if you have two Jews in a room, you have three opinions. And that certainly is true when it comes to Jewish views on the afterlife. But that said, I did want to give him an answer, and I'm going to try to give you an answer too. I have some notes I may have to refer to because it's a pretty complicated story, and as I say, there is not one view. But we can look at how views of Judaism on the afterlife have changed over time. And it's very clear, and actually maybe the most simple time was in the biblical period. In the biblical period, there was a common belief in what we call Sheol, which was really kind of a place where all souls went after death. The evil and the good, Jew and non-Jew alike. And basically in Sheol, what are called Rephaim, or shadows or ghosts, resided. And that's where they stayed in perpetuity. It was thought in that era that you could contact these ghosts or shadows and they could give you information about your life in this world. But that was actually forbidden. It's forbidden explicitly in Leviticus, so people were asked and prescribed from contacting the spirit world. And that's kind of where things stayed until really the period during the Hellenization of Judaism around 200 BCE. And that's when everything started to change. During that time, the notion of Sheol started to winnow away, and a new idea came in. That was the idea that we call today Gehenna, or Gehennim. And actually, Gehennim was a real place in a valley just outside of Jerusalem, which was a place where many people buried their dead. And in fact, during the Roman period, Romans would burn their dead, in that spot. So it had a very negative connotation, actually. So during this time, around 200 BCE, this notion of Gehenna emerged, and this was really when we started to hear about the end of days, life after death, et cetera, and even resurrection. And there are two theories on why this happened. One was after the destruction of the first temple, Jews started to really look at their sacred texts and try to kind of decode the secrets and mysteries in them. And the other was, particularly following the period of the Maccabees, in an era when Jews basically martyred themselves for a greater cause. People wanted to have the belief that people who were dying were not dying in vain, but actually were going to a better place. So this is really when the notion of heaven and hell started to emerge in Judaism. And that kind of took us up right through the period around the year 0, when we had a real struggle between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who were a conflicting group of Jewish intellectuals and power brokers who had different views about this topic. The Sadducees actually did not believe in the existence of Gehenna. The Pharisees did, and they basically won the day. And this was in the time when Christianity was just emerging from Judaism, and that Pharisaical notion of Gehenna and heaven and hell was taken into Christianity at that time as it was emerging, and obviously became a very integral part of Christian theology. So that's kind of where things were. I'll just check my notes here, that by 200, the year 200, during the period of the Mishnah, there clearly was a belief in the afterlife. There was a statement in the Mishnah, all Israel has a portion in the world to come. And this world to come notion is very important. In Hebrew, it's olam haba, the world to come, and that will continue now throughout the rest of our intellectual and religious history as a very important concept. In the Talmud, there are lots of different opinions expressed, but initially it was thought that when a soul died, it would go to Gehenna or Gehenna, but it wouldn't stay there for more than a year. And Gehenna, again, was a hell-like place or purgatory. But again, this notion that the soul wouldn't stay there for more than a year. And actually, this is an interesting little tidbit. Religious Jews will mourn their parents after their death for 11 months. Why 11 months? Why not 10 months? Why not a year? Well, the idea was this. If you didn't want to mourn your parent for a year, because some people ended up staying in Gehenna past that year-long threshold, and if you stayed beyond the year, your chances were not so good of getting out of there. So you didn't want to mourn your parent for more than a year, because that might imply somehow that they required that type of mourning and that their soul had not gone to a better place. And you didn't want to in any way encourage the idea that your parent was going to be staying in Gehenna for an eternity. And so it was safer to just mourn for 11 months and be done with it. So there, after the Talmudic era, there were lots and lots of different approaches to consideration of the afterlife. A rabbi named Sadia Gaon around the year 900, who was a Neoplatonist, really introduced this idea of a person's soul after death residing with God until the Messiah would come, at which point the good would go to Olam Haba, the world to come, and the evil would go to Sheol. So the reemergence of Sheol as a concept there, kind of as a hellish place. Maimonides saw the soul as a form of intelligence, and after death, that soul of the good would be reunited with a greater divine intelligence, and the wicked would actually cease to exist. He actually was challenged on this because, of course, he believed in resurrection, or the actual re-embodiment of souls after, when in the Messianic age. And so he actually had a bit of a hard time resolving that. Later still, we have kind of the Jewish mystical traditions weighing in with the Sefer HaBahir in the Middle Ages, which brought Eastern notions of the afterlife into Judaism, and in particular reincarnation came into the Jewish lexicon at that time. And then later still we had the Zohar, which was very complicated, written by Moses de Leon in the mid to late 1200s. And that book posits that the soul is actually split into three at the time of death. The Nefesh is reincarnated into another person. The Ruach went to a 7-tier Gehenna, or purgatory-like place, which reminded me of Dante when I read about that, actually. And then the Neshama, which was the divine essence in all of us, returned to God and was reunited with God at that time. All of that said, where does that all leave us? Well, I guess what I would say is there are so many views of the afterlife in Judaism, many of which, most of which really were espoused and promulgated by very wise people, but all of which seem to, in one way or another, differ with each other or with all the rest. So I guess what that means in practice is, no surprise, you get to choose. Because really, within Judaism, there's every notion of the afterlife, including a notion that there is no afterlife. What is true is that most of our time and attention we don't spend on the afterlife. A much stronger theme in Judaism than Olam Haba, or the world to come, is Tikkun Olam, or repairing this world we live in right here. So that's where many of us spend most of our time, although certainly when we consider death, we consider what might happen to our soul on the other side. For JUTV, this is Rabbi Kenneth Hahn saying, Lehitraot, see you soon. It's been a pleasure being with you. And again, if you found this useful, please share the link with friends, and we'll see you again next Monday for Music Monday.